Good evening, and welcome to the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. We are here tonight in Monroe Hall, appropriately. I am Scott Harris, Executive Director of Museums for the University of Mary Washington, and we're very happy to welcome both our audience here in Monroe Hall with us as well as those watching online. We're grateful to the Friends of the James Monroe Museum as being sponsors of so much of our programming, and that also includes the James Monroe Memorial Foundation, another of our sponsoring organizations with whom we're pleased to work. We are concluding 8 years of observances, programs, lectures, exhibits, and the like that commemorated the bicentennial of the presidency of James Monroe. And it's been an interesting journey in all the different ways we've sought to do this, and we are so pleased that we'll be able to bring that to an appropriate close this evening as we then look beyond into other topics and areas. The presidential administration of James Monroe spanned the years 1817 to 1825, a period of growth and transition for the United States. 5 states joined the Union: Mississippi, Alabama, Illinois, Maine, and Missouri. The U.S. population grew by nearly 50% to 10.5 million. Monroe made extensive regional tours of the country. In the northern states in 1817, the Chesapeake region in 1818, and southern states in 1819. And it was to such acclaim that contemporaries called his administration the era of good feelings, at least for a while. The irony of the good feelings label was reflected in domestic policies that in some cases fell short of resolving long-standing and in some cases ultimately tragic events. On Monroe's watch came the Panic of 1819, the first major depression to hit the country since the 1780s, resulting in high unemployment and an increase in bankruptcies and foreclosures. 1819 also saw passage of the Civilization Fund Act, which sought to relieve tensions between indigenous peoples and the inexorable white settler incursions by mandating cultural assimilation of the native population. This legacy, the legacy of this act includes the Indian boarding schools that endured into the 20th century. And Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise in 1820 to deal with the growing sectional divide over slavery, marking a major milestone in the sequence of events that led to the Civil War. In foreign affairs, the Monroe administration signed 3 significant treaties dealing with U.S. security and expansion that confirmed and demilitarized the border with Canada by limiting naval armaments on the Great Lakes, established joint occupation of the Oregon Territory, and secured Florida for the United States from Spain. Monroe also granted diplomatic recognition to emerging South American republics in 1823 and 24, and in December 1823 announced what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, declaring the Western Hemisphere closed to further incursions from European nations. The doctrine influenced American foreign policy repeatedly during the 19th and 20th centuries and is referenced in current diplomatic, economic, and political debates. So to formally conclude our museum's bicentennial commemoration of Monroe's presidential legacy, we are pleased to welcome 2 very special guests. Dr. Lindsay M. Chervinsky is a presidential historian and the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. She is the author of the award-winning books The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, and Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. She is also co-editor of Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. Lindsay regularly writes for public audiences in the Wall Street Journal, The Bulwark, Time Magazine, USA Today, CNN, and the Washington Post. She holds a BA in History and Political Science from George Washington University and received her MA and PhD from the University of California, Davis. Bob Karachuk is the editor of the Papers of James Monroe, a historical research project sponsored by the University of Mary Washington and administered under the James Monroe Museum. The project's mission is to expand access to the correspondence and other public and private papers of the 5th President of the United States through the publication of selected documents bearing on his life and legacy. Bob holds a BA from Yale College, an MA from the University of New Orleans, and a JD from Tulane Law School. He also did graduate work at the University of Connecticut. He has worked on documentary editing projects focused on the early U.S. Supreme Court, John Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Pinckney family of South Carolina. So please join me in welcoming our panelists tonight. Lindsay Smith. James Monroe was succeeded as president by John Adams once the tumultuous election of 1824 was finally decided in the House of Representatives in February of 1825. How much continuity in policy was there between the two administrations? Where did Adams perhaps differ in his approaches to the issues of the time from those of Monroe?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here with you all. And I think there was actually a great deal of continuity because John Quincy Adams was such a powerful voice in the Monroe administration. One of Monroe's, I think, greatest choices as president was surrounding himself with people that had really different expertise and knowledge and experience. And in doing so, he built off of George Washington's model. So it was the right way to create a cabinet. And I think his best position selection was the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And then he had the really good sense to actually let him do the job. Because for all of Monroe's experience, I would argue his diplomatic periods were perhaps his least successful. And so he had he had the benefit of having a very seasoned diplomat who also had a huge impact on domestic policy. So just some of the ways that there was continuity. What was called the American system was an idea originally put forward by Henry Clay, which was a series of internal improvements across the United States, things like road development, canals, bridges, harbor fortifications. That was something that Monroe intellectually was quite supportive of. He wasn't sure that the Constitution actually gave him or Congress the authority to do those things because they often crossed state lines, but he certainly thought that it was a good idea for the nation. John Quincy Adams had no such constitutional objections, and so he was very encouraging of those types of projects. They also, I think, on foreign policy were quite aligned because John Quincy Adams had largely shaped Monroe's foreign policy. And so certainly things like the Monroe Doctrine, Adams agreed with because he wrote it. So, I think that these pieces that are quite fundamental to what an early presidential administration looked like were in continuity. The difference, I think, largely comes from their experience as president. Monroe was revered as the last of the founding generation, and that, I think, contributed to his stature in the era of good feelings. He had the very lucky experience of leading at a time when there wasn't really a solid opposition party, whereas John Quincy Adams was dealing with the rise of Andrew Jackson in a serious way. And while I think he was a savvier politician than most people think, the political culture was shifting pretty dramatically under his feet, and he wasn't able to respond to it and capture it in the way that Jackson was.
Well, Bob, the Papers of James Monroe, as we noted, examines, interprets, and publishes selected portions of the documentary record of his life and career. You're currently working on the volumes that pertain to the presidency of Monroe. What can you tell us about what the evidence has to say about his relationships with some of the other major figures of this era, particularly the next two presidents, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson?
Well, let me say, Scott, thank you for inviting me to join you both this evening. I would focus first on John Quincy Adams because, like Lindsay says, JQA was probably the most talented and experienced diplomat of his era. But that doesn't mean that he necessarily ran the show. This is an instance where John Quincy Adams was definitely allowed a free hand, but he wasn't the ultimate decision maker. If you look at the documents, there are many instances where James Monroe would ask for a certain set of papers. John Quincy Adams would draft them. John Quincy Adams had a very different tone than James Monroe, usually more blunt, more aggressive, and more didactic. James Monroe many times would agree with the point, what John Quincy Adams was aiming at, and instead would tone it down to make it more, for a turn of phrase, more diplomatic sounding. There are instances where John Quincy Adams, being a experienced and strong-minded individual, would get James Monroe to reconsider, to second guess, to not necessarily give up on something, but to take a different approach. There were also many times where James Monroe sort of pulled the leash on John Quincy Adams. They were, from my perspective, kind of a dynamic duo of diplomacy in that era. They came to the process with different talents. I think James Monroe had a much better sense of the niceties, the diplomatic touches that you needed to have to deal with people, both face-to-face and in writing. Whereas John Quincy Adams had a certain aggressiveness in a good way. Not merely assertiveness, but a willingness to put forth his argument and defend it. One of the things that John Quincy Adams remarks in his diaries about James Monroe is, I really like it, this guy listens, and sometimes changes his mind. And I think that when John Quincy Adams became president, he was hoping for the same kind of relationship with not only his Secretary of State, which to an astonishing degree he got, but he also, I think, was hoping it with the other members of his own cabinet. In part, that was because John Quincy Adams' cabinet, there were a couple carryovers from James Monroe's. The Attorney General, who had served through James Monroe's entire 2 years, ended up being the Attorney General for John Quincy Adams. That's William Wirt. William Wirt was a Virginian who had a not entirely complimentary opinion of James Monroe, which wasn't uncommon. That James Monroe wasn't an intellect, neither educated nor naturally clever. But what both Wirt and John Quincy Adams liked about Monroe was that he would take time. It drove them crazy, but Monroe would take the time to understand what the situation was that he was looking at, what the context was, and find his way to a wise decision. Didn't always work, but he wasn't one who would react too quickly, at least as president.
And John Calhoun, the Secretary of War, said almost identically that kind of a description. Yeah?
Yes. There were many people like James Monroe or not like James Monroe who did feel that he was very approachable, that it was easy enough, it was comfortable engaging with him. He did not intimidate people. I don't think this was just his personality. I think he made an effort to try to work with people. At the same time, when he was pushed to a point of principle, he could be obdurate. He would not pull back. And in those instances, he was sometimes not well served by his own principled stand. I'd also point out that the Secretary of the Navy under John Quincy Adams was a carryover. And it's interesting to me that I think John Quincy Adams may have taught Monroe to be a more capacious foreign policy actor. I would hope thinker, but at least actor. At the same time, I think that James Monroe taught John Quincy Adams to be a hopefully less assertive individual, which is very difficult for somebody who was as self-confident as John Quincy Adams. He was a smart man, he was a well-educated man, he was an experienced man. I would argue that in many instances, the most frustrating thing about his thinking that he was always right was that he often was right. He would get you the right answer, but he would do it in the most potentially offensive way. And he was known for that. When it comes to Andrew Jackson, James Monroe's experience of Andrew Jackson was, I would say, practically the complete opposite of his experience with John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson, even though he wasn't a member of the cabinet, was a personally popular individual for having, quote unquote, won the War of 1812. That the war was already over when he won the Battle of New Orleans was beside the point. He may not have won the war, but he made the American people feel like the Americans had won the war. Andrew Jackson was a difficult person. He was very self-absorbed. He was one who would skate to the very edge of what was proper or authorized or legal, and oftentimes trip over that line, taking down the policy, the law, the whole scenario, and
As in Florida.
as in Florida, as in Florida twice. What is most interesting to me about the experience of Monroe and Jackson together is that Monroe really handled Jackson with kid gloves from the very beginning. Even before Monroe became president, he invited Andrew Jackson to be his Secretary of War. Jackson felt that was not of interest and probably beneath him, but I think more he just wasn't interested in the desk job, thank you. But Monroe cultivated Jackson, and I think he did because he thought of Jackson as the potential popular man who needed to be tied to, I guess I would say, an anchor. The anchor being proper form. Jackson was one who, when he decided he wanted to do something, did it. When he was authorized to pursue Native Americans out of Georgia into Florida, which was a Spanish-held territory, he not only pursued the Native Americans as authorized, but went all the way on to Pensacola and took over the entire colony. Well, that wasn't only a constitutional problem, that was a diplomatic problem. Constitutional problem because Congress is the one who authorizes war action. Attacking a foreign colony, that was a problem. It's one thing to chase after the Native Americans, but it was entirely another thing to take over the colony. Jackson does a similar thing in flaunting the norms after Monroe appoints him governor of Florida, when Florida becomes a U.S. territory. Jackson goes in as governor with all the authority of a Spanish governor, and there is some the stereotype of, well, the authority of a Spanish governor would be authoritarian in a certain sense. Jackson went so far as to imprison the previous Spanish governor, who happened to still be in Florida, and he also went at loggerheads with the U.S. a federal judge. Even despite these things, Monroe was very careful to excuse Jackson's overextensions, going too far. And I struggle a little bit with why he didn't just pull the rug out under Jackson. Jackson goes on to be a much bigger problem for John Quincy Adams, because Adams doesn't even have that, he doesn't have the natural talent of cultivating a difficult individual, because difficult individuals don't tend to have that talent. He also doesn't have Jackson connected to him politically or organizationally. There are other presidential candidates over the years who are affiliated with Monroe. In fact, a couple of them are in his cabinet. There's William Crawford, who, interestingly, I wonder whether Crawford would have been a choice of Monroe. He inherited Crawford as Secretary of Treasury from James Madison. Then we move on to another individual, not a presidential candidate, but a Secretary of the Navy, another inherited. I find it interesting that John Quincy Adams, when he comes around to being president, he's willing to take people in from his experience as Secretary of State, but he doesn't appreciate James Monroe's difficulties with the people who he inherited from James Madison. John Quincy Adams had difficult relations with at least William Crawford, certainly. And Adams actually invited Crawford to be to continue as Secretary of the Treasury. So I struggle with John Quincy Adams and what he learns from his experience as Secretary under James Monroe. What works for him as he carries it forward and what doesn't work for him. And I think one of the things that doesn't work for him is that he doesn't have the affability, the ability to just sit still, to let people talk, to listen, to hear them out, and to let them have their say so that they have been heard, whatever Monroe's decision was going to be.
Thank you. Now, Lindsay, I didn't intend to aim that question at you, but I want to see if you've got anything you want to add to especially you've got the sequence from Monroe, a two-term president, generally popular. You've got Adams in that one term with the question of its legitimacy, the corrupt bargain issue, and then we get to another age, the age of Jackson. You know, the political dynamics of that time are very much in flux. What does it say about where the country was at that point, where the political alignments were going?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it gets at so many different pieces that we have to pull out from that period. The first is that we really have to separate in our minds the combination that we have created where a one-term president is a failed president. Because oftentimes they really have nothing to do with one another. You know, my favorite example of this is George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, for all intents and purposes, had actually an incredibly effective presidency. He handled the end of the Cold War with unbelievable skill and grace. And much of his defeat is basically about the economy. And for most presidents do not have a whole lot of power over the economy. What is happening in the economy tends to be a long-term trend and is not much having to do with the executive branch. And I think there are some similar patterns that are happening at this period of time. We often see one-term presidents coincide with major tectonic shifts under the political system. So realignments of political parties, either the destruction of parties or the creation of new ones, the shifting of different bases and alliances and regions and voters with those parties. So, you know, I think John Adams is a good example of this. John Quincy Adams is a good example of this. In the 1850s, we see a series of one-term presidents as new parties are emerging and the Democratic Party is fracturing and the Whig Party is disintegrating. We see this again towards the end of the 19th century where voters are kind of rethinking their alliances, the progressive movement. So a lot of what is happening in the 1820s has nothing really to do with Monroe, Adams, or Jackson. Instead, it's the influx of a lot of new voters with more expansive suffrage for non-property white men. It's the shifting west of the nation. It's the tensions over slavery and a real shift in political culture about what people want their leaders to be. And the idea of voting for an elite highly educated intellectual from New England is not going to be appealing to a lot of people from the West, and there is increasing power in the West. So there are these huge changes happening. A lot of them don't have a whole lot to do with the person, but they are then either exacerbated or highlighted or made more powerful by the individual personalities we have at play. And Jackson symbolizes, or comes to symbolize, the common man, despite the fact that he was enormously wealthy and was really among the wealthiest presidents we've had. He presented himself as the common man, presented himself as what we would call today a populist. He was able to speak to the resentments of Westerners who felt like they hadn't been well represented by those in the New England elite. And John Quincy Adams, for all of his strengths, of which there were many, was either uninterested or unable in speaking to those political trends. And I think it is some of both. I think that he genuinely believed, like his father before him, and I would also say like George Washington, that the president was not supposed to pander to that. The president is supposed to be above whatever political machinations are happening. They're supposed to represent all people. They're not supposed to be politicking. Now that suited him because he also didn't want to do it, because he didn't particularly like it, because he didn't really like people. So, if you find most people annoying, it's kind of hard to be a politician in the way that you're expected to be a politician at the time. So I think there are a lot of different factors at play. What I do think is important to note in terms of his legacy and his presidency is many of the things that he advocated for. So in addition to the American system, he advocated for a national university. He wanted a national, an astrological center or tower that his opponents made fun of him for wanting a lighthouse in the skies, but basically like an early naval observatory. He wanted all of these things that came to pass, many of which came to pass under Jackson. So Jackson actually embraced many of the policies that Adams had advocated, that Jackson's allies in Congress had defeated. So I think we really have to see this period of time as sort of a through line, that there are these continuing threads, and Adams represents a lot of them.
Well, as we noted in the introduction, Monroe dealt with two problematic domestic issues in his presidency: Indian relations and slavery. We're going to take a moment and address each one of those in turn. Lindsay? Monroe tried to facilitate voluntary cultural assimilation of native peoples while also attempting to moderate the expansionist pressures from states bordering their land. Georgia, very good example. So how did this go under Adams and then later under Jackson?
Well, I think many of the early presidents, I would say really from Washington up to John Quincy Adams, believed in the sovereignty of native nations. They wanted to uphold treaties and agreements that had been made, but they either didn't have the willpower or the political power or the military might to prevent white settlers from encroaching on those lands and therefore violating the treaties. This was George Washington's biggest problem too. He also wanted to defend native territory. He just didn't have an army with which to do it, and there was no appetite for that among the American people, and that was a problem all the way up through Jackson. So Adams faced many of the same challenges Monroe did. He faced native nations who were asking for their treaties to be upheld, a Supreme Court who was upholding most of them, and American people who just wanted to disregard them anyway. And so he found himself trying to encourage assimilation in the same way that Monroe had, or to encourage the sale of lands in return for the creation of other territories out west. But he, like Monroe, tried to do so in a voluntary way, without the use of force to compel that sort of action. And that is the main shift with Jackson. So Andrew Jackson is, of course, I think among his most infamous actions is his treatment of native peoples, that he used military force and persuasion. Often he actually went down to the territories to use his own personal symbolic presence and the history that he embodied, which included a lot of violence against native peoples himself, to force them to agree to really punitive agreements and to sell their lands for terms that were, I don't know that anyone would call fair. And then when that didn't work, that of course led to the main nation that had resisted these efforts were the Cherokee Nation. And that led to what we consider now the Trail of Tears, in which the Supreme Court upheld Cherokee rights, and Jackson turned a blind eye to whatever Georgia wanted to do, and they basically basically forced the Cherokee Nation out of the territories in the Southeast to incredible destruction of homes, food, property, incredible loss of life, and there's a reason this moment is seen as a pivotal one in Cherokee Nation.
Bob, with respect to slavery, Monroe supported the legislative maneuvers of Henry Clay in Congress that culminated, thank you very much, in the Missouri Compromise, or compromises, as there's actually more than one piece of legislation there. Contemporary observers and most historians have emphasized Clay's role in the matter, but what is the written record? What is the effort of the papers and its research finding out about Monroe's contributions?
The Missouri crisis. It's complicated.
I know. Don't use verbs, just
the Missouri question, which is how it was thought of in the couple of years that the question of Missouri becoming a state was truly complicated in that, from the perspective of looking at Monroe, in that most of what Monroe was doing at this moment in time was in person or through allies. Monroe is a leader, as a president, created a cabinet where the individuals in the cabinet ended up having their own followings in Congress, both the House and in the Senate. Monroe certainly had individuals in those places who would have been his followers. But Monroe's point in creating a sort of team of rivals as a cabinet was to get consensus in his cabinet on particular policy choices, particular diplomatic choices, whatever the situation was. He would try to create a way forward that all of his secretaries could embrace. They might not like it, but they wouldn't reject it. In the case of the Missouri crisis, the Missouri question, he did not have that kind of agreement. He knew he wouldn't get that kind of agreement from his secretaries. Obviously, John Quincy Adams was anti-slavery. How he was anti-slavery prior to becoming a congressman, there's an evolution to that that I'm not familiar enough to summarize here. But he was definitely anti-slavery, nominally at least. He would not have embraced the idea of the extension of slavery. Whereas William Crawford from Georgia, William Wirt from Virginia, John Calhoun from South Carolina, these three very much embraced the idea that slavery existed. Slavery needed to be managed, I think is the nicest way of putting it. That slavery was not going to be abolished anytime soon, if ever. Monroe didn't even bring the question to his cabinet because he knew it would just magnify and advertise the disagreement. So when it came around to trying to influence the conversation going on in Congress, Monroe had very few direct avenues. As a Republican, small r, president, it wasn't his place to be influencing what was going on in Congress. He was supposed to execute the law. He was not supposed to legislate, at least he wasn't the starting point of legislation. In Congress, he appears to have relied, and this is obvious, on William Crawford and his followers, on John Calhoun and his followers, and certainly on Virginians who would have had a similar perspective. We don't have a paper trail that really helps us with this. We have one instance where James Barber in the Senate clearly was speaking directly with Monroe, and inadvertently and unfortunately let slip that Monroe was willing to consider a compromise. This was in February of 1820, at the height of the debates and arguments happening in the House of Representatives. This almost undercut Monroe's first term, and some would say that it almost cost him a second term, because the politicians in his own state of Virginia happened to be, almost simultaneously with the Missouri crisis, deciding who they were going to endorse for president. It was assumed that it would be James Monroe. He was currently president. He was a Virginian. He was a popular Republican. But it was there. He wasn't a conservative, small c, enough Republican for the old guard in Virginia. Monroe, at the same time that he's trying to work conversation and work his allies in the Congress, is trying to prevent his own state from endorsing somebody else. Who else they would have endorsed, I have no idea. That's an entirely another question. But they were threatening to not endorse Monroe. The paper trail is very slim, but the best part of the existing paper trail is Monroe's correspondence with George Hay. George Hay was a prominent Virginian in his own right. He also happened to be Monroe's son-in-law. He was also happened to be Monroe's closest political confidant. George Hay is in Richmond trying to tap down some of the more strident resistance to a negotiated path out of the Missouri crisis. The information that Monroe conveys to Hay makes it very clear. He is connected. He has word of what is going on. It also makes clear that he feels like he has no influence, because as president, he's not supposed to be involved. He says multiple times to Hay, of necessity, I'm in a delicate situation. I can't do anything. And that's because as president, he's supposed to be, at least in his own mind, and certainly in small r Republican theory, he's supposed to be president of all the people. Not just slaveholders, not just Republicans. So there's not a great paper trail for what we know must have been going on. It wasn't part of the culture of presidential leadership at this moment. It also wasn't quite necessary, because if Monroe is talking with people in Washington, it's not like Nixon. There's no tape recorder. There are no messages going back and forth. It's clear that whatever was happening where Monroe was exercising influence, it was with allies who had influence, who already agreed with him, and with people who were coming into his office. He had a pretty good open door policy. The flip side of that is people on either side of the issue of the Missouri question could obliterate their own influence, their own legitimacy, if they were seen consulting Monroe, or if not consulting Monroe, conferring with Monroe, acting on his behalf. Because that meant that the executive was tinkering with legislative. So there's no great paper trail, because there's no reason to have a great paper trail, because people were avoiding Monroe and he was avoiding people, even though he was trying to get the word out. There is one instance where we have a great letter, again from James Monroe to James Barber, where the statehood bill for Missouri is essentially connected with the statehood bill for Maine. Monroe may not have known this was going to happen beforehand, but he did not approve it because he was an astute enough political observer to realize this was going to deflect potential northern allies of slavery in the South and in the territories, because if they had to vote against Maine to prevent Missouri from coming in, those northern friends were going to undermine their own influence. The next election, they were going to be thrown out. Somebody who was more aggressively in support of Maine would be voted in. It took a couple of weeks for James Barber, who actually tied Maine and Missouri together, to realize, oh my God, we're losing all our northern, again, friends, because we put them in this political spot where they can't vote for us if they want to continue to be active in their communities. We have that one letter where Monroe lays out a very astute analysis of what's going on politically. He knows what's going on. And he says, I can't do much about it.
So sometimes it's what's there and sometimes what's not there.
Yes.
Filling the spaces between.
Yes.
Lindsay, we could do an entire program on the Monroe Doctrine, and as people in this room know, we've done many. James Monroe inadvertently, I think, bequeathed the doctrine mantle to many of his successors who confronted international relations, principally in that sphere, including, if anyone's paid attention, just about every president of the 20th and even 21st centuries. Is this doctrine mantle a uniquely American trait? And if so, what does it tell us about the nature and the perceptions we have of the presidency?
Well, I don't think that the word doctrine is just used for American foreign policy, but here's where I think it is different. So there are other types of systems where one person is in charge of foreign policy. If you're looking at real authoritarians, for example, China today, one person is in charge of foreign policy, period. But there's a much, in most of the time, when you have that sort of authoritarian system, as long as the same person is in power, you're going to have continuity of that policy for the duration of their reign. What is unusual about the United States today is that we change our president every 4 to 8 years, and we still give them that power to basically set foreign policy. So, for example, if we look at Great Britain is largely an executive by committee. The British cabinet, while there is a foreign minister, the prime minister is the first among equals. But if the prime minister does something that the cabinet doesn't agree with, they're going to resign. And they have their own power in parliament, so they have enormous authority over what that policy is. That is not the way the American system works. The American system, the president is the main voice in foreign policy, and has been so since George Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793. It did, of course, say neutrality, but let's not let details get in the good way of the story. So Washington really carved out jurisdiction for the president to have sole discretion over what foreign policy was. And since then, presidents have had the ability to either continue what has happened before or to carve a new course of action. And when they either carve a new course of action or take particularly bold action or are responding to an international crisis in some defining way, then we often refer to that as a doctrine. Now, of course, the Monroe Doctrine has, I don't know that it would have gained the same sort of symbolic importance over American history if many other presidents hadn't found it useful to refer to and hadn't found it useful to build off of. So, of course, the Theodore Roosevelt corollary kind of brings it back into memory. Woodrow Wilson refers to it often, and we've had a number of presidents do so more recently. So I think that in some ways, presidents can create a doctrine, but it's up to their successors to determine whether or not anyone remembers it or cares about it. And that, I think, is another important characteristic about our executive branch system, that presidential legacies are not crafted while the president is still in office. Or at least maybe I should say this. The breadcrumbs are laid while they're in office, but how that is kind of congealed into a thing, how it is remembered, what the impact of it is, and what the long-term lasting significance is determined by those that follow.
And it's worth noting, Gary, that the Monroe Doctrine was never called the Monroe Doctrine by James Monroe. Came a lot later.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And it's also not just one thing. So I'm sure this is something you've talked about in previous programs, but the Monroe Doctrine was actually 3 different documents. It was, of course, the presidential address to Congress in writing, not in speaking, thanks to Thomas Jefferson. It was a letter to Britain, basically telling them that we will kindly take care of things ourselves, thank you. And it was a rather strident letter to Russia, basically telling them that the Western Hemisphere would not welcome their interference. And those 3 things were quite important because they were responding to different pressures at different times, speaking to different audiences in different ways, and laying out what the American policy was in a sort of multifaceted system.
Well, before I ask a wrap-up question to each of our speakers, we'd like to throw it open to our audience, both here and online. And so I will invite any question that y'all may have for either or both of our panelists.
I'll go, Scott.
Yes, sir.
They didn't have James Carville saying it, the economy's stupid, but you had the Panic of 1819. To me, that was a bigger deal, but you're implying he really had no role in trying to get the country out of it. I mean, it's not the same as today, but how did he react to it?
Monroe's reaction to the Panic of 1819, it's true. There was very little he could do. And again, that part of the issue was that it's not even a question of economic tools or economic theory or approaches. He wasn't the legislature. He was the president. It would be up to Congress to decide what path to take to address an economic issue like that. And Congress wouldn't have been sophisticated enough in its understanding of economic theory or have the economic tools. To me, one very interesting thing about the Panic of 1819, it brings out the fact that a president's power in this era, as Lindsay has already said, is very much tied to foreign policy. That's where he has room for maneuver, room for true initiative. When it comes to what's happening in Congress, a president had to be very careful about how he tried to influence, cajole, manipulate. Monroe wasn't inclined to attempt too much because of his understanding of Republican principles, because of his understanding of what Congress would put up with. Very soon after Monroe becomes president, he actually says to Congress, we really need to pass an amendment so we can do some internal improvements. That would have been a terrific idea. The problem is that Congress didn't like being told that they didn't already have that power if they decided that they had that power. And that blew up into a little bit of a controversy between Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, Congress, and Monroe. And it was probably healthy for Monroe to hit that so early on because it reminded him that he had to be very delicate with how he approached Congress. He could certainly respond to Congress, and once consulted or given a bill to sign, could respond. But taking initiative, that wasn't his role on the domestic side.
Anything to add from your perspective?
Nope.
Okay. Oh, yes, sir.
To build off that question just now, the Panic of 1819 does not harm Monroe's re-election. The Panic of 1837, the effects of that does harm Van Buren's effort to get reelected? What was different between the two?
There was an opposition party. The Whig Party had coalesced in opposition to Jackson. So it's not to any way diminish his two victories, but it's a little bit easier to ride out a panic when you don't have a real opponent.
And I think that's one of the things that Monroe would never necessarily ask for, but it was simply the fact that he got to govern in 2 terms during a period of realignment in between the 2 party systems of that era.
Yep.
And that's what gave him, at least initially, the good feeling term, although that was also really based on the response to his tours of the North, the newspaper using that term. But even as things did get messier with the panic and some of the other things that divided the electorate, it wasn't yet in a 2-party system. So.
Yeah, and Jackson was able to kind of pull together what was then called the Democratic Party, largely through force of personality, but was holding together a lot of different factions that had a great deal of disagreement with one another, including on things like economic policy. Martin Van Buren did not have that personality. He did not have the sort of the force of his persona. He was not a war hero. He was also a Northerner, but largely dependent on Southern support, and that was always an uncomfortable place to be for Martin Van Buren, for Buchanan, for a lot of others. And so when you do have those economic challenges, and you have a rising opposition party, and you have different opinions within your own political party, that's going to fracture, in particular, what your re-election can.
With President Monroe's letter to General Lafayette in February of 1824, inviting him to the nation, back to America as the nation's guest, have you encountered any letters, documents, diaries, talks about whether he was perhaps working with Madison, Jefferson, even John Quincy Adams to kind of bring the nation together, being that the election was so polarizing, whether you're in favor of Jackson or John Quincy Adams, the nation had split. So by bringing this nonpartisan hero of the American Revolution, the last surviving major general, do you think, or have you found anything that could support him kind of bringing him back to America, to bring the American people together, or potentially to work towards getting John Quincy Adams elected?
I can't imagine why you're asking. So I don't know if it was so much in response to the election. I think it was more in response to the sheer terror people felt after the Missouri crisis. And we see this in Jefferson's letters, we see this in Adams' letters. They write about it back and forth to one another. We do know, of course, that Monroe was in communication with Madison and Jefferson for the duration of his presidency. And certainly John Quincy Adams was writing about looking through this crisis, and they were all recognizing that the compromise was a temporary one, that this solution was probably at some point going to fail, and that the problem of slavery was the potential fatal flaw of the Union. And so that was an opportunity to focus on revolutionary history because it's safe. And we actually have seen this same sort of thing happen. You see it again in 1850. You see it again after the Civil War because it's a history that everyone can agree upon and everyone can celebrate. You see it in 1876 when Reconstruction is falling apart. So anytime the nation has had moments of real internal strife, we tend to look for history that we can all gather around as a rallying point and as a way to remind ourselves of our shared bonds as Americans. And that was very much on the minds of Adams and Jefferson as they were engaging in their very famous correspondence after they had been friends and then enemies and then frenemies and then finally friends again. And so I think that was probably more the impetus. I think I encourage everyone also to think about what that means for our current moment, that we are in a real moment of turmoil and stress, and however you feel about what is happening, there's clearly a lot of division in the nation. And so I think that the founding period and our anniversary is a real opportunity to think about the incredible inheritance we have received, which is this founding of this nation and the sacrifices that went into it, and that was the same thing they were trying to remind their fellow Americans.
Oh, maybe that. Well, it was Franklin who answered when I asked what did we have, he said a republic if you can keep it. And that's where we are. Do we have any other question? Ah, yes.
So kind of building off of that question, I'm so glad that you brought up such a monumental point. Given your deep knowledge of the personality traits of Monroe, how do you think that he would approach this type of political landscape? Would there be any differences in the way that he would try to unite the nation from before?
It's an interesting question. The thing about the founding generation that I think is so powerful when you look through their writings is whenever they're faced with a crisis, they tend to take a step backwards and to seek a compromise and moderation. Especially if it's a crisis that's a constitutional one, if it's not clear that the Constitution provides the means to get out of whatever the crisis is. We see this in the election of 1800, you see it again and again. And they do so because they had skin in the game. They had fought in the war, or they had been in Congress, or they had been in the state government, and they knew how incredibly hard it was to build something and how easy it would be to tear down. And so they were not complacent about the future of the nation. They did not think it was a guarantee. And I think in this moment, one of the challenges we're in is that we as a people have become complacent, that we think, they heard me say this earlier at dinner, but we think that just because we've survived for 250 years, we will continue to survive for another 250. And not to be the bearer of bad news, but most republics fail at 300 years. So what they would say is this is a moment to remind ourselves of our fragility, and that each day is an opportunity to try and recommit to the strength of the republic such that the next 250 years might be possible. I certainly would never speak for him because I actually don't know him as well as I know some of the others, and also he's dead, so that's not a good idea. But I feel pretty secure in knowing that I think they would all remind us of those founding principles and to try and uphold our commitment to them.
You give me equal time. You're good. Oh, yeah. Any others? Thank you for those questions. Before I do the last one, I do want to note that there are 2 more programs that the James Monroe Museum is doing this year, December 6th, 2025, from 9:30 to 12:30 p.m. on this campus at the Hurley Convergence Center. Jan Williams will present her final Deck the Halls decorating program for us after 45 years. And we are so grateful for what she's done for us over the years and benefit the museum. We invite everyone to sign up to come out for that. It's filling up, but if you want to see really the end of an era in this community, someone who's had such an impact and been so good to our museum, we urge you to come out for that, have a chance at the decorations that she'll do, have the good camaraderie with her. And then December 12th from 6 to 8 p.m. at the James Monroe Museum, our annual holiday open house. We'd be delighted to see everyone there. So after 8 years, after all the things we've done, I boil it down to a gimmick question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And I will start with Bob. If you had to characterize the presidential, it sounds like a beauty contest question, doesn't it? If you had to characterize the presidential legacy of James Monroe in just one word, what would that be and why? And as I said, you cannot use doctrine. Okay, go.
This is an unfair question. Doctrine is the obvious answer. Everybody knows that because that is the big legacy. But one that I think we forget about, which has its own reverberations. I'm going to use 4 words. I apologize.
You're in government. Go ahead.
Adams. President John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a long experienced diplomat. Years and years in Europe. He did not have a particularly large following in America to speak of before he became Secretary of State. It was 8 years in that position under Monroe that gave him the connections and the exposure in Washington across the country, and a track record of being the front guy negotiating treaties, even if Monroe was the deciding guy ultimately. without becoming Secretary of State, without being called back from Europe to be present at the center of power for America, John Quincy Adams would never have been president immediately after Monroe. What he would have done at that point would probably have been continued as a diplomat. It's hard to imagine him getting elected to Congress again without that footing in America. So I'll give you two, President and Congressman John Quincy Adams.
Well, Lindsay, he blew the whole premise apart, so you can do whatever you want. You can do the word thing, you can do something else. For a concise summation of the Monroe legacy, what would you aim at?
Turning point.
She did 2 words, okay.
We're gonna pretend there's a hyphen.
Okay, sure.
It's a turning point for the nation. The nation has just come out of the War of 1812, the Second War of American Independence. It is officially an independent nation. It is coming into the community of nations as, if not a power, one that will be. It is a turning point for the nation internally and domestically in terms of its westward shift. It is a turning point for the political culture, the political system, the party structure, economically, slavery, all of the things. So, turning point.
Okay, well, as the originator of the question, I remain faithful to the context, and I will tell you mine, it's sincerity. Everything that I've been able to tell from my examination of Monroe's career and his outlook on most things does not betray guile, does not betray a Machiavellian sense of things for the most part, but it does show a sincerity. It shows that whether he was right or wrong, whether he took forever to arrive at a position, as so many did say, and yet stood by it, whether he saw what the dignity and the equity of a situation could be for native peoples, even for enslaved peoples or freed peoples, whether he got to the point where he in his mind thought he ought to go, I believe at least that there was a sincere effort to try and find those compromises, to try and find the best way forward. That's not to say other politicians of that age didn't have it before or since, but I think that Monroe is one of the more sincere people to occupy the office and to try to carry out the charge in almost any office given to him. So, we can debate that one another time perhaps, but I think we've reached the end of our time. Please join me again in thanking Bob Karachuk, Lindsay Chervinsky, and thank all of you.